You know PlanB, right? So what do you think of that model then? A lot of criticism, like Corey from Swan.
This is the end game of how we value things. I think it was with a mindset of a maximalist saying this is the only thing that will exist. So even in that, the model breaks down because Bitcoin gets to zero inflation.
What do you think a 10-year price prediction?
I think it's the lower bound. We already knew this, right? Even in 2017, people were buying shitcoins, right? Everyone's buying a whole lot of crap, but it was retail. But the bulk of the money didn't want to deal with all that crap, and they just bought Bitcoin. But when Ethereum came along, they bought Bitcoin and Ethereum, and now they're buying all sorts of things at large scale. And so you see that deviation down from that straight line. And I've been waiting to do this chart, trying to figure out how to do the chart or stock to flow of the crypto asset bucket, and maybe it actually brings us back up.
Right.
Maybe that one works. So I don't think that we're on this path with Bitcoin. I think it's overvaluing it. I don't think we're going to do 110% per year according to stock to flow. So which makes it very different. Well, what are we at? Let's say we're at below $1 trillion, but let's say we're at $1 trillion and we go to 10 trillion, which is gold. That's a 10x. And maybe we go to it's a 40x to $40 trillion if that is the end target. It's 40x, 133x in the last bull run up to 2017. 133x, right? That was 2 years.
You'd be at over 100 and some trillion dollars. But when is that? I'm not saying it's never going to get there, but what time frame?
2 years versus it's going to take a decade or more to get to that full saturation. So I'm going,
unless there's, like you said, a black swan event that collapses the dollar, in which case money might flow into Bitcoin somehow.
Yeah, maybe. But we're talking about today's dollars, and maybe. No, I don't think so. It'll flow into traditional assets as well.
They'll just go to cash while the markets are crashing. They're not going to jump into Bitcoin. Everything's going to go Bitcoin. Everything will get decimated if that happens.
I don't think Bitcoin's main enemy is fiat. No, wait. I don't say enemy. It is probably that fiat is the enemy of Bitcoin.
I was like, wait, what?
I'd say the market competition for Bitcoin is not fiat, because no one holds fiat as a store of value unless you're a trader. I'm storing my value for 48 hours before this thing bottoms, right?
That's it.
Right?
Yeah, short-term store value.
You're buying a house, right? You might be buying fine art. You might be buying equities. You might be buying collectible whiskey, right? So that's the competition. So that's how much of a chunk are we going to take out of the real estate's $200-300 trillion cap? I think that's what you would talk about around valuations, not around fiat.
So what do you PlanB, right? So what do you think of that model then? A lot of criticism.
I think it's got fundamentally, the idea is good. The fundamentals of the idea is that we've seen in the nature of financial markets, this is the end game of how we value things. So that's solid. And so then he did it with Bitcoin, but I think it was with a mindset of a maximalist saying this is the only thing that will exist. So even in that, the model breaks down because Bitcoin gets to zero inflation, so the price should go to infinite, and it should be the rule of the universe. And I think if you to take the model and then you add to it the real dynamics of the market of competitors to Bitcoin, and there are competitors, because you cannot tell me Bitcoin dominance is 100%. It's far from it, and it's sliding.
It was for a while, but you're right. Now it's 50%, which means everybody's eating market share, right?
Yeah, and you'll notice that it started to fall away from that trend line because the dominance started to drop. So I think that it was skewed. I think PlanB
he's missing that in the model. That's right. That's the key.
He didn't acknowledge shitcoins. As much as
because that money would have otherwise gone into Bitcoin. Yeah,
you cannot create a model in what you wish the future will be. It has to be based on reality. He did that model, and shitcoins were in existence, obviously, and it was gaining dominance. So I think that needed to be taken into account. So I like the model.
I had him on the show a few weeks ago, actually, and I said one thing that you're lacking. I'm not the only one that said this, but one thing you're lacking in the model is demand. He goes 100%. Don't disagree. He's like, directionally, I think this is correct.
No, I disagree with that. I actually, before I really understood what he was doing, I said, well, it's supply and demand, right? And no, it's about scarcity and valuation. It's not a demand and supply model. Idea around it is the more scarce it is, that creates a dynamic around demand and supply. supply, both sides, not just demand, because every market we see demand, you see supply meted, right? Because otherwise you can't buy the asset if no one's supplying it. So it's a model around scarcity and valuation. And so it sidesteps the issue of figuring out the random walk with demand and supply, which is what I do to get there. It creates a really nice, it's kind of like E equals MC squared. It distills down into something really clean, and you don't have to look at demand and supply. Everyone's trying to work that out because it's a complex beast. And you just go, here, look at this. This is scarcity, and this is how we should value scarcity. I just don't think he acknowledged the real scarcity was actually inclusive of Bitcoin, which diluted the scarcity, inclusive of shitcoins, which dilutes the scarcity. I actually love the model. I think that it just needs to be broader. I think I'll try and...
You should recreate it, yeah.
I want to try it. See, maybe I'm full of shit and it's a broken idea, but because that's the thing, you have these great ideas, you run the numbers, oh no, that didn't work, right? It was a broken. You can at least you can test your thesis with support or not if you run the numbers. So yeah, worth doing. I think it'll be worth doing.
Favorite chart? What is your favorite chart right now? What is Willy Woo looking at the most right now?
I'm looking at it's technically called the Bitcoin Liquid Supply Shock Oscillator. I'm looking at it right now. And so it's effectively a demand and supply. So supply shock is badly named because it's not a supply shock. Supply shock is actually a ratio. It runs a ratio of the coins that are not likely to be sold divided by the coins that are likely to be sold. So there's a whole family of supply shock, but you could call that on-chain demand and supply. So, it's just broadly a category of, wow, how do we do this? Well, I know an idea. How about we, let's say all the coins sitting on exchanges are likely to be sold and all the coins that are off the exchanges are unlikely to be sold. You run ratio. That's a demand and supply. And so what about the guys that have held their coins for 5 months or more? They're unlikely going to move because they've held for 5 months. All the other guys. So you do that ratio, and that's also a demand and supply. And then now the really juicy stuff is like, let's look at all the wallets and all the address and cluster them and look at the behavioral patterns of these investors and name the ones with high precision that don't sell. They just buy. They're like Michael Saylor versus the swing traders, and then you run that ratio. So that one's really timely. You get down to, wow, it's 24-hour responsive. And so that's what I really like. That's what I'm looking at because we've got that kind of eclipse moment where we haven't had since October 2020. And that's what I'm looking at the most. And actually everything I do now, at least like my newsletter, it's all around demand and supply, and particularly using these kinds of forensics metrics. So yeah, that's what I'm looking at the most. It's in terms of on-chain.
I typically ask people, what do you think a 10-year price prediction is? But I'm going to tell you what I think you think it is, and you tell me if I'm right. This is different because of the things you said. I think you think in 10 years, we're at about $10 to $14 trillion, which would bring us to around $700,000 to $1 million in coin, on parity with gold in 10 years. Do you think it's more or less than that?
I think it's the lower bound. I think it'll be
lower
more.
bound.
I think it'll be more. Maybe close to 20 trillion.
20 trillion in 10 years? Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll double the market cap of gold more likely than not, you're thinking, over the next 10 years.
Yeah, I'm actually more comfortable in your zone, but within that range. That's my guess. I think a lot's got to do with how this plays out within regulation. A lot of unknowns right now.